Swedish literature refers to literature written in the Swedish language by writers from Sweden. The first literary text from Sweden is the Rök Runestone, carved during the Viking Age circa 800 AD, with the conversion of the land to Christianity around 1100 AD. Sweden entered the Middle Ages, during which monastic writers preferred to use Latin. Therefore, there are only a few texts in the Old Swedish from that period. Swedish literature only flourished when the Swedish language was standardized in the 16th century, a standardization largely due to the full translation of the Bible into Swedish in 1541. This translation is the so-called Gustav Vasa Bible, with improved education and the freedom brought by secularization. The 17th century saw several notable authors develop the Swedish language further. Some key figures include Georg Stjernhielm, who was the first to write classical poetry in Swedish, Johan Henrik Kellgren, the first to write fluent Swedish prose, Carl Michael Bellman, the first writer of burlesque ballads, and August Strindberg, a socio-realistic writer and playwright who won worldwide fame. In Sweden, the period starting in 1880 is known as realism because the writing had a strong focus on social realism. In the late 19th and early 20th century, other influential writers included Ola Hansson and Victoria Benedictsson. In the 1900s, one of the earliest novelists was Hjalmar Söderberg. The early 20th century continued to produce notable authors, such as Selma Lagerlöf and Per Lagerkvist, a well-known proletarian writer who gained fame after World War I was Vilhelm Moberg. Between 1949 and 1959, he wrote the four-book series The Emigrants, often considered one of the best literary works from Sweden. In the 1960s, Marge Sjöwall and Per Wahlöö collaborated to produce a series of internationally acclaimed detective novels. The most successful writer of detective novels is Henning Mankell, whose works have been translated into 37 languages. In the spy fiction genre, the most successful writer is Jan Guillou. In recent decades, a handful of Swedish writers have established themselves internationally, such as the detective novelist Henning Mankell and thriller writer Stieg Larsson. Also well known outside of Sweden as the children's book writer Astrid Lindgren, author of works such as Pippi Longstocking and Emil of Maple Hills. Old Norse. Most runestones had a practical, rather than a literary, purpose and therefore mainly of interest to historians and philologists. Several runic inscriptions are also nonsensical by nature, being used for magical or incantatory purposes. The most notable literary exception is the Rök Runestone from circa 800 AD. It contains the longest known inscription and encompasses several different passages from sagas and legends, in various prosodic forms. Part of it is written in alliterative verse, or fornada slag. It is generally regarded as the beginning of Swedish literature. Middle Ages. The Christianization of Sweden was one of the main events in the country's history, and it naturally had an equally profound impact on literature. The Gock runestone is a case in point of how the older literature dissolved. It uses the same imagery as the Ramsund carving, but a Christian cross has been added and the images are combined in a way that completely distorts the internal logic of events. Whatever the reason may have been, the Gock stone illustrates how the pagan heroic mythos was going towards its dissolution. During the introduction of Christianity, literature now looked to foreign texts to provide models. By 1200, Christianity was firmly established and a medieval European culture appeared in Sweden. Only a selected few mastered the written language, but little was written down. Complete manuscripts are only found from the early 14th century, written in Latin. The earliest known complete books in the Swedish language are from the end of that century. Most education was provided by the Catholic Church, and therefore the literature from this period is mainly of a theological or clerical nature. The majority of other literature written consists of law texts. 16th and 17th century Reformation literature. Swedish Reformation literature is considered to have been written between 1526 and 1658. However, this period has not been highly regarded from a literary point of view. It is generally considered a step back in terms of literary development. The main reason was King Gustav Vasa's wish to control and censor all publications, with the result that only the Bible and a few other religious works were published. At the same time, Catholic monasteries were plundered and Catholic books were burned. The king did not consider it important to re-establish higher education, so Uppsala University was left to decay. There were comparatively few groups of writers during this time. The burghers still had little influence, while the church clerics had had their importance severely reduced. The Protestant Reformation of the 1520s left priests with a fraction of the previous political and economic power. Those Swedes who wanted higher education usually had to travel abroad to the universities of Rostock or Wittenberg. Apart from Christian Reformation literature, there was one other significant ideological movement. This was Gothicism, which glorified Sweden's ancient history. While contributions to Swedish culture were sparse, this period did at least provide an invaluable basis for future development. Most importantly, the Swedish Bible translation of 1541, the so-called Gustav Vasa Bible, gave Sweden a uniform language for the first time. Secondly, the introduction of the printing press resulted in literature being spread to groups it had previously been unable to reach. Renaissance literature. The period in Swedish history between 1630 and 1718 is known as the Swedish Empire. It partly corresponds to an independent literary period. The literature of the Swedish Empire era is regarded as the beginning of the Swedish literary tradition. Renaissance literature is considered to have been written between 1658 and 1732. It was in 1658 that Georg Stjernhjelm published his Hercules, the first hexametrical poem in the Swedish language. When Sweden became a great power, a stronger middle-class culture arose. Unlike the age of the Reformation, education was no longer solely a matter of ecclesiastical studies such as theology. During this era, there was a wealth of influences from the leading countries of the time, namely Germany, France, Holland and Italy. It was symptomatic that the man who came to be known as Sweden's first poet, Georg Stjernhjelm, was more acquainted with ancient philosophy than with Christian teachings. Gothicism also gained in strength. During the Swedish Empire period, it developed into a literary paradigm, the purpose of which was to foster the idea that Sweden was a natural great power. 18th century. The 18th century has been described as the Swedish Golden Age in literature and science. During this period, Sweden produced authors and literature of a much higher standard than ever before. One key factor was the political period known as the Age of Liberty, and the first Swedish Freedom of the Press Act written in 1766. It meant the ultimate breakthrough of secular literature. Naturally, the impulses that invigorated Swedish cultural life had their origin in the European Age of Enlightenment. The main influences came from Germany, England and France, and these were reflected in Swedish literature. The Swedish language became enriched by French words, and ideas of liberalization were based on the English model. Swedish literature consolidated around 1750. This is considered the start of a linguistic period called Late Modern Swedish. The first great works of the age were those of Olov von Dalen, and in particular his weekly then Svenska Argus, based on Joseph Addison's The Spectator. Dalen gave a sketch of Swedish culture and history using language which had an unprecedented richness of sarcasm and irony. In the 1730s and 1740s, Dalen was unrivaled as the brightest star in the Swedish literary sky. He was the first to refine the language for practical purposes, in comparison with the labor poetry of the 17th century, and he was the first author to be read and appreciated by the general public. In the 18th century, Latin rapidly declined in popularity in favor of the national language. One of the first authors to aim his books directly at the general public was the world-renowned botanist Carl Linnaeus. Later key figures included the poets Johann Henrik Elgren and Carl Michael Bellman. 19th century Romanticism in European history. The period circa 1805 to 1840 is known as Romanticism. It also made a strong impression on Sweden, due to German influences. During this relatively short period, there were so many great Swedish poets that the era is referred to as the Golden Age of Swedish poetry. The period started around 1810 when several periodicals were published which rejected the literature of the 18th century. An important society was the Gothic Society, and the periodical Aduna, a romanticized look back towards Gothicism. One significant reason was that several poets for the first time worked towards a common direction. Four of the main Romantic poets who made significant contributions to the movement were the professor of history Erik Gustaf Geyer, the loner Erik Johann Stagnelius, the professor of Greek language essayist Tegner, and the professor of aesthetics and philosophy P.D.A. Atterbohm. Early Liberalism. The period between 1835 to 1879 is known as the early liberal period in Swedish history. The views of the Romantics had come to be perceived by many as inflated and overburdened by formality. The first outspoken liberal newspaper in Sweden, Aftonbladet, was founded in 1830. It quickly became the leading newspaper in Sweden because of its liberal views and criticism of the current state of affairs. The newspaper played its part in turning literature in a more realistic direction because of its more concise use of language. Several authorities would regard Carl Jonas Love Almqvist as the most outstanding genius of the 19th century in Sweden. Beginning in 1838, he published a series of socially and politically radical stories attacking both marriage and clerical institutions. Several of his ideas are still interesting for modern readers, in particular the work that Garn, which reached the German bestseller list as late as 2004. Naturalism or realism. Naturalism is one name for the literary period between 1880 to 1900. In Sweden, however, the period starting in 1880 is known as realism. This is partly because the 1880s had such a strong focus on social realism, and partly because the 1890s was a period of its own. The 90s poets. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Scandinavian literature made its first and so far only impression on world literature. From Sweden, the main name was August Strindberg, but Ole Hansen, Selma Lagerlöf and Victoria Benedictsson also attained wider recognition. The breakthrough of realism in Sweden occurred in 1879. That year, August Strindberg published his The Red Room, a satirical novel that relentlessly attacked the political, the academic, the philosophical and the religious worlds. August Strindberg was a writer world famous for his dramas and prose, noted for his exceptional talent and complex intellect. He would continue to write several books and dramas until his death in Stockholm. The 90s poets. The Swedish 1890s is noted for its poetic neo-romanticism, a reaction to the socio-realistic literature of the 1880s. The first key literary figure to emerge was Verna van Hoyden Stam. His literary debut came in 1887 with the collection of poetry Valfotok. The Vandrings are. The novelist Selma Lagerlöf was arguably the brightest star of the 1890s, and her influence has lasted up to modern times. Two of her major works, which have been translated into several languages, are The Wonderful Adventures of Nils and Gösta Berling's Saga, but she also wrote several other highly regarded books. Lagerlöf was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1909, mainly for her storytelling abilities.